Thomas Frank is under huge pressure right now at Tottenham Hotspur, but should the club keep him or should they replace him? Well, today we're going to analyse that situation. We've got all of the top candidates linked with the job, as well as Thomas Frank. By the end of this video, hopefully we'll come to a decision as to what the club should do. What would you do though? If you were in the Tottenham director's seat today, would you keep Thomas Frank based on what you've seen so far this season, or would you look for a replacement? All of these options have been linked in some way with the club, and a lot of them were suggested by you guys at home on Twitter. So let's start with a lot of Tottenham fans' favourites, according to my mentions. Anyway, that's Roberto de Zerbi. Now, is it just me that thinks this one is real unrealistic right now? Marseille currently scrapping out for a Ligue 1 title. They are flying, the best goal scorers in Ligue 1 in France by an absolute country mile, doing real damage in the Champions League as well, playing an extremely attractive brand of football, that 4-2-2-2 that he's become so well known for. Obviously, we saw Roberto de Zerbi at Brighton, we've seen him at Marseille, we know he wants to pack out those central areas, he wants to work the ball through the middle of the pitch. I've read reports, I've read quotes from him talking about how he only wants his fullbacks and his wingers to be used when the centre of the pitch isn't an available or viable route to attack, and I do think that would suit Spurs. They have a serious volume of very good central midfielders. Bergvall, Sarr, Archie Gray, Madders when he's back, Xavi, Palhinha, Bentancur. There's a gluttony of midfield options. And when you consider last season, he had Marseille finishing second. Okay, it was to one of the best PSG sides we've ever seen. But also the work he did at Brighton, which was absolutely exceptional. You can see why he is such a top candidate here. However, his brilliance, I think, does come with the offset of his volatility. A little bit like Antonio Conte in the past. We know he can really blow up with board members if he's not happy with transfers, if he's not happy with the situation. I think, though, the reason I've got him in unrealistic is that maybe a step to Tottenham would feel like a sideways step for him. I don't know. Is that harsh? I'm a bit confused on this one. I'm a bit conflicted, but I don't see the assimilation between De Zerbi and Tottenham working at all. Fabian Hurzeler is doing an outstanding job at Brighton right now. He's still so young, only 32 years old. He had him finishing 8th last season. This season, they currently sit in around 5th in the league at the time of recording. You know, I think personally, Hurzeler has been given a little bit too much stick at times. There's been question marks about his style of play. I think following on from De Zerbi, who had a very clear identity, because Hurzeler is a bit more pragmatic, doesn't necessarily have that De Zerbi style identity, it goes against him at times when, you know, results have proven we're looking at a future elite manager here. This is a gaffer who at Brighton is averaging 1.7 points per game. It's really solid. It is really, really solid. If he finishes in a Europa League spot this year, it's hard not to see big clubs being interested. But a mid-season move for Hurzeler? Again, I just think that is unrealistic. Especially when you consider the job at hand at Spurs, the flux and the pressure to give that to a 32-year-old mid-season. That's a big ask. We're going to talk about Thomas Frank at the very end, and we'll make the choice then, but I think that's too big of an ask. He should stay where he is. Pochettino, that is just unrealistic for me. Like, I think Tottenham fans in general would probably sway more towards, I could see him coming back. I think I would be happy with him coming back because of the failures of recent gaffers. But they always say, don't they? And I agree with them, never go back to your ex. This is a World Cup year. There's no way he's leaving the US national team in a World Cup year where it's being held in the US. He's going to give himself every chance of high-profile victories at that tournament. To leave 6 months prior to it, despite the fact US have been really tumultuous in their results in the build-up to this World Cup, would be a mistake. Taking him back is a huge risk, and is it ever going to reach those heights again under him? I have major doubts. I wouldn't go back to Poch. Brendan Rodgers? No, not right. I don't see a world in which he goes to Tottenham after what happened at Celtic. Even towards the back end of his Leicester campaigns, I would have been really surprised to see him then take a step up to a Tottenham Hotspur. Very stable pair of hands and actually a really underrated tactician. But I think right now, if I was shooting out between Thomas Frank and Brendan Rodgers, I'd side on the side of Thomas Frank nearly every single time. How about Julian Nagelsmann? Again, I think this is completely unrealistic, and what you're starting to see here, we're starting to see here, is a picture form of how sparse the managerial market is at the moment, how difficult it's going to be to convince managers to join your club mid-season, and then you come on to the even greater aspect of Tuchel out of contract, Iraola out of contract, Glasner. There's a lot of contractual issues developing for managers in the summer. So do you hold your nerve and wait until the summer? I suppose that also comes with its own risk then, though, doesn't it? Because other clubs might well be in a situation where they need managers. And if they need managers, let's say Man United need a manager, or Liverpool need a manager, or Real Madrid need a manager, where do Tottenham sit in that ranking of dream or desired destinations for those coaches? They might well be down the pecking order. Whereas if you move mid-season, are you above them in the pecking order? I don't know, man. This is really, really tough decision to make here. Next up, we've got Seb Hernandez. And when I did this in the summer, when we were talking about who should be replacing Ange, I really thought that Seb Hernandez would be an outstanding candidate for the role, but I thought it would be unrealistic. Coming off the back of that Pochettino victory, would want another season at the club. His contract runs until 2027 to try and prove himself to an even higher level. I still think he would be a really, really outstanding option. I'm not totally unconvinced he wouldn't be gettable mid-season as well. I know Stuttgart are having a good campaign. I think they're 6th or 7th in the Bundesliga, still, with the 4th best expected goals against record in the league, 4th best expected goals for record in the league. They are a very, very solid unit, Stuttgart, and the way he's got that ball progression working through players like Angeli Stieler is a real joy to behold. He's such an excellent coach. You can see why clubs like Bayern Munich, Bayer Leverkusen were interested in him in the summer. But he did choose to stay at Stuttgart, so it's not going to be easy to get him. If you're Tottenham, you're probably going to have to spend a significant amount of money on a buyout clause for his contract. You're then going to have to give him a significant amount of money to spend in the January window, you would think. But he would still be a very solid contender for me. I think people forget that when he took Stuttgart over, they were bottom of the league. He survived that. He's done damage in the European scene. He's won a Pokal there. He's consistently challenging for the Champions League places. So that club development over time should attract a lot of attention. It's not easy to do that. Graham Potter, no, definitely not right. I see no world in which he exits West Ham in the way he did, with the way they were playing football, the damage he did to his reputation at Chelsea, being a former Chelsea manager, a former West Ham manager, to go to Spurs. I just don't see any world in which this happens. How about Xavi Hernandez, who I think is a lot of Tottenham fans' favourites for the role? A lot of them have in their mind Xavi, the way he played at Barcelona, particularly across that first 18 months. And that first 18 months were sensational. He took Barcelona over. Again, I think people forget this, when they were 9th in the league. He ended up winning La Liga in his second campaign. His second campaign was excellent, but it wasn't necessarily the flowing football you'd associate with Barcelona under a gaffer like Enrique or Flick or Guardiola. It was much more defensive, it was much more pragmatic. He would be a good option, and he would be an interesting option. I would love to see Xavi at Spurs, just to see what happens. Can he take that style of football, that identity, and bring it to the Premier League? And another thing I think does definitely go for him is he's used to working in chaos. That financial element of Barcelona during his tenure, with the levers being pulled, all of the issues behind the scenes with the presidency, weighed extremely heavy on him, and it is probably the most pressurised position in world football, the Barcelona manager. It's incredibly scrutinised in the Catalan press. It's so political. It's just a difficult sort of poison chalice to have. And I think that definitely affected him. I'm not totally convinced about his handling of the Robert Lewandowski situation. There were criticisms, major criticisms about his training. And some of the defeats, particularly those 3 Clasico losses, were really ugly looks. But everything at Barca is sort of overanalyzed to the nth degree. So small, tiny details are blown up onto massive, massive scale. And when you lose big games like that, or you lose in Europe in the manner he was losing, that is going to happen. Other positives I think you've got to look at with Xavi are his promotion of youth. Kubasi, Lamine Yamal. At Tottenham, there's a really good core of young players. Archie Gray, Destiny Udogie, Lucas Bergvall, Xavi Simons would really benefit from working under a manager with his youth pedigree, I think. And then you have his reputation as a player, which I think does have to come into this. This is a guy who immediately walks into any dressing room and commands respect from the players because of how good he was himself, because he's won La Liga titles as a player and a manager. So, in terms of pedigree and stature, he's probably the biggest name on this list. But does that make him the most effective? And does it make him right for Spurs? Andonio Iraola's name still being linked, still a great option. He's into the final 6 months of his contract. Haven't seen any signs of that deal being done. record points tally when he took over at Bournemouth, record goal scorers for a single season at Bournemouth, fewest losses in a single season at Bournemouth. He has basically broken every Bournemouth coaching statistic. And I think some of the positives around Iraola are clear. You know, his brand of football is extremely fun to watch. It's so high pressing, it's really intense. He's taken huge scalps off of big teams. I remember coming off the back of his first season in charge, there were question marks about his record against the Big Six or the teams that finished in, I think, the top 8. It wasn't a great record. He sat all of his players down. He went through that. Last season, you look at some of the head-to-heads against the best teams in the league. I mean, home and away, he beat Arsenal. And again this season, you can see they are a nightmare to play against. How well suited, though, is that Spurs side to that system? Can they press in the way Iraola is going to want? Well, the one thing you would say to counteract the people who are saying they can't is that Iraola has made every player he's got his hands on at Bournemouth look like a completely different beast. Be that playing in a different role, playing in a different structure and system, everybody, and I mean everybody's game has gone up about 3 levels. Be that the members of the back 4 last campaign who were so good that they've ended up at PSG, Real Madrid, Liverpool and Arsenal. Be that players like Alex Scott, who's in a new role and has totally taken to it. Be that Antoine Semenyo, who has gone to unbelievable levels comparatively to the days we saw of him at Bristol City. You know, I think Iraola definitely has that touch of gold. It is, though, a big job stepping up from Bournemouth to Spurs. We've seen it with Thomas Frank this season. It's all well and good improving players at clubs like Brentford, but can you do it in the pressurised situation at Bournemouth? You know, a lot of the positives we're saying, and I'm saying right now about Iraola, we were saying about Thomas Frank 18 months ago. Do you just give that time to Thomas Frank? We're going to come on to that in a little bit. Edin Terzic's name still being linked. I don't think this is the right fit, honestly. Obviously, he had such a good record at Dortmund, that Pokal win. Failing to do it on the final day of the Bundesliga season was heartbreaking. The Champions League final, heartbreaking. Especially him being a member of the Yellow Wall, you know, a Dortmund fan since he was a boy. But does that passion and that style of play translate away from Dortmund? I think there have been reservations across Europe. That's probably the reason Terzic hasn't got another job since. I suppose you could look at him at least having some Premier League experience. You know, he was Slaven Bilic's assistant, right, at West Ham. He's worked with Jurgen Klopp pre him being in the Premier League at Borussia Dortmund, but he would still present a massive risk. I just don't think he's got the experience outside of Dortmund, and the fact that he hasn't been in management for nearly 2 years now, I'm unconvinced. Oli Glasner also has yet to sign a new contract. Like Andonio Iraola, his deal runs out in the summer. Could you tempt him mid-season? I think it's pretty clear he was left irritated by the summer business a lot. In fact, the quotes from the weekend where he said, if you play for the first time in your club's history in European football, I think the right answer is to invest and not save, and we saved. That's a really damning quote on the Crystal Palace hierarchy from Oli Glasner. I think the summer business, it was very clear he wasn't happy with it either. The fact that Mark Gahey nearly left on deadline day will have ruffled huge feathers. And it's hard not to say that he's done an outstanding job at Palace, becoming the first manager to win a trophy in their history, then winning the Community Shield, the 19-game unbeaten run in which he beat Liverpool 3 times. You know, you can't sort of dampen that down. He's done that whilst selling players like Eze, Elise. This is an outstanding coach. In fact, I don't think he physically could have done a better job at Crystal Palace. The unity he has got from that squad, the system he has developed, the way he's connected with the fans, it has been remarkable. And there's a great interview with him recently on the Sky Sports Premier League YouTube channel with, I think it's Natalie Jedra, where he's talking about the system he's developed and how the system isn't important, but the positional play and the principles within it are. It's so interesting. If you haven't watched it already, I suggest you go and watch it, because I do think Glasner is ready to take the step to, you know, one of the top 5 clubs in world football. He is a really good age, he's got great experience, he's got a history of winning trophies, be that the Europa League at Frankfurt or the FA Cup at Crystal Palace. He's shown that he can play in multiple different systems, be that a back 4 in Germany, a back 3/5 in the Premier League with Palace. He's turned over squads, and he's just such a critical thinker. I think his intelligence goes a long way to his coaching style. I mean, you look at the work he's done with a player like Jean-Philippe Mateta. Before Oli Glasner, he went 2 goals, 1 goal, 5 goals, 2 goals, 2 goals in his 5 seasons at Palace. Since then, he's exploded. Only Mo Salah and Erling Haaland have scored more goals in the Premier League than him. So I'm going to say it's a great option. His experience is vast. It's underrated, Glasner's experience. Marco Silva, another manager whose contract is up in the summer. You can start to see the narrative that's building here for me. The volume of managers that are available in the summer comparatively to right now. Do you hold your nerve and look at the summer as being a more viable time to change gaffers? I think a lot of clubs will, especially with the World Cup and managers potentially leaving roles there, because Marco Silva, has he taken Fulham as far as he can? I think will be a question mark in his head. They start the season quite slowly, but they're starting to find a rhythm and pick up good results now. And again, I feel like people have forgotten how highly rated Marco Silva was when he was coming out of Portugal. The job he did at Estoril was sensational. And since then, it's been a bit of an up and down career in English football until he arrived at Fulham, where he has really exploded. You know, in his first campaign at Fulham, I think they scored the most goals in the history of the Championship to get promoted. Since then, they've been a very solid, very consistent Premier League side, and he would be a good option. You can't deny that Marco Silva would be a very solid contender for this role with his experience across multiple different teams in multiple different leagues. Very reminiscent of Thomas Frank, though, for me. Done a really excellent job with limited resources and resources that don't feel like they're going to be improved anytime soon. It's not as if Fulham are going to suddenly start spending hundreds of millions of pounds every summer. I don't see that happening, just like I didn't see that happening for Frank at Brentford. So if the change was to be made, does that hold him back? Do you follow Frank with Silva when Frank hasn't quite worked, when the situations are quite similar? Tottenham fans are really interested to hear your take on if you think Marco Silva would be a viable candidate here. Michael Carrick had a superb CV at Borough, but this would be the wrong appointment, I think. It would be slightly too big of a jump after being sacked by Borough. He took them over in a really difficult situation. They were 21st when he took them over. You know, he had them up there competing in the playoff places, up there competing for automatic promotion for a while, but I think his stubbornness tactically, fans fell out of love with towards the back end of his tenure. Since then, he hasn't managed a side. I would be really surprised to see him make a jump from being sacked in the Championship to taking over Tottenham Hotspur, despite the fact he's extremely highly rated as a coach. How about Cesc Fabregas? The talk of the town, really, I would say, in terms of the next best coach coming out of European football. Xabi Alonso was this guy, I would say, 12 months ago. Now it feels like it's Cesc Fabregas. You know, Como are 5th in Serie A. They're just 4 points off the top of the table. There's serious talk about whether or not they could launch a title bid this season. Why not? This is one of the outstanding tactical minds in the game right now. The way he's got Como set up from their out of possession play, you know, this is the best pressing side in Serie A by a distance. They allow the fewest passes per defensive action by a mile in Serie A. And then you get the freedom of this attacking expression as well, where players in that forward area are allowed to move and swap roles and play sort of where they want, despite the fact he is, you know, basing his system around the positional play style. In forward areas, you find right wingers popping up in the 10 popping up in the 9 dropping really deep. I think that's probably one of the reasons Nico Paz looks so exciting in that Como side, is because he's allowed to drift where he wants and pick up spaces that are really, really dangerous. It's no surprise to see he's going to end up back at Real Madrid in the summer because of Cesc Fabregas' coaching level. I think some of the other reasons that he's clearly going to work is that he is a really interesting study. You know, there are reports that he was keeping notepads through his playing career on his coaches and what they did well and what they didn't do well. And those coaches, you know, they're big names. Guardiola, Mourinho, Arsene Wenger, Antonio Conte. He speaks 4 different languages, which also I think is a big positive in the modern game. People take that for granted. Dressing rooms now are so diverse. I think that is a huge positive aspect for Cesc Fabregas. But everybody tried to get him in the summer. He's a shareholder in Como. Inter Milan tried to get him in the summer. I heard Thierry Henry speaking on the overlap saying that, you know, pretty much every big club was interested in him, but they couldn't convince him to go. He didn't feel the project was right. Is the Tottenham project the club you leave Como for? You've got them absolutely fine. They are competing potentially for a Serie A title. You're probably going to have your pick of clubs in the summer if you choose to make a change then. Do you dip mid-season for Spurs? I honestly think this is unrealistic. I think he absolutely will hold his nerve, try and get Como into a Champions League space, which would be ridiculous given where he took them over. Ridiculous work. And if that is the case, then potentially in the summer, you know, that Barcelona job might be available. Hansi Flick might decide to move on in the summer, and that is, you know, Cesc 101. So that leaves us with Thomas Frank, and we have to talk about whether or not this is actually the right decision to move on with him mid-season. For me, I'm very much on the fence here. I really am. Tottenham fans, I want to hear your opinion on whether or not you would move on from Thomas Frank. Yes, things have gone horribly recently. Horribly. The home record is an abomination. One of my best friends is a season ticket holder. He pays £2,300 for his season ticket each season. He has seen, this calendar year, 3 home league wins. That's £766 per win. So clearly the home record has to be fixed. He has to sort that out. The away record is marginally better. And I think a lot of Tottenham fans' real problem is the style of play to watch. It isn't the prettiest style of play. And when things go wrong because of that, you don't have the crutch to lean on that at least we're entertaining. At least it's fun. Combine that with some of the team selections, particularly in defensive midfield areas with Polina and Bentancur. That experiment has really run its course, you would feel like, in a lot of Tottenham fans' minds. The fullbacks not really working to the best of their ability in Porro, Udogie, Jed Spence at times. The forwards just aren't linking, aren't finding the net, aren't expressing themselves. But he does have big injury problems in that forward area. Solanke gone, Maddison gone, Kulusevski gone, Son gone. It's over 70 goal involvements from last season. Dropped out of the side. Kolo Muani has come into the side. He looks a little bit better now. Richarlison, I think most Spurs fans would probably be happy to move on from. So he is facing a bit of an uphill battle. I'm going to defend Thomas Frank a little bit here. Now, some of the comments about fans, they can have their own opinions on those. I'm not a Tottenham fan, so I'm not going to put myself in their shoes, but I think fans have every right to boo if they want to boo. You know, these are people who pay their hard-earned living to come and watch. If they're not happy, they're more than welcome to voice it. So I think to say fans aren't real fans by booing, I'm not in total agreement with. And just judging by some of the players' sort of reactions and body language, things that have been said on social media, I'm not sure there's a total alignment in the dressing room, but it's hard to comment on that as well, isn't it? We're not inside the Tottenham dressing room. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But here's what I would say. In the summer, the market is going to be much more diverse than it is right now. I think it's a really small pool of options if Spurs choose to move on from Thomas Frank. Personally, I would stick with Thomas Frank until the end of the campaign, give him a season, then judge him. As we look at it today, the managerial market doesn't scream immediate bounce to taking Tottenham Hotspur to being a Champions League side, to competing in the Champions League and having an impact tomorrow with one of the best coaches in European football. It doesn't. I think when the summer comes round and we've had another 6 months of Iraola, another 6 months of Oli Glasner, potentially Seb Hernandez, could Cesc Fabregas be available? I think that is the time that Tottenham might well think about addressing this situation. But for now, I think Spurs should hold their nerve, and I know that a lot of fans are not going to be happy with that.